I'm personally delighted to join you today for what I know will be a very rich and thought-provoking discussion on inequality and the role of philanthropy. So I think, as all of us know, there are many different dimensions to this discussion. We generally think of income inequality and wealth inequality, but we also need to look at factors like ancestry and class, gender, race and ethnicity, access to education and the opportunities that flow from that, and access to the judicial system and fundamental human rights. So most of us are concerned about inequality because it raises important questions about fairness and social justice. But as we see around the world, it can also undermine social cohesion. It can impair the well-being of both the rich and the poor in society and diminish economic growth if we're not fully utilizing the skills of all of our citizens. So certainly in Canada, when we think about our failure to fully engage our Indigenous peoples, as well as new immigrants and women, these are good examples that reinforce the importance of embracing reconciliation, pluralism, and dealing with this issue of rising inequality. I'll just ask the panelists if they would like to share a few thoughts before we move on.
Well, we had a great discussion as well, and what really strikes me about inequality, what bothers me the most, I suppose, is that when people have an attitude of, oh, it's good enough for them, that they've identified that the inequality is a them approach. And the example that I spoke of, how we heard again this morning how income in the developing world has, extreme poverty is reduced by half. That only means people have moved from $1.25 a day to $2 a day. That's hardly something to celebrate. We've made progress, but it's still insufficient. And the idea that people have reached a certain level, an adequate level, that's the part that offends me most about inequality, is because it's not gone, it's just maybe ameliorated.
Yeah. Yes, I think he deserves a round of applause for that. You know, I think it was Oxfam in their most recent 2016 report, one of the statistics was that the wealthiest 62 people in the world actually have wealth that's equal to the bottom 50%. So that gives you a sense of the massive inequality in the distribution of wealth.
Again, we saw the chart this morning that showed that collectively the 10,000 private and public foundations in Canada have assets of around $60 billion. We're dispersing $3 billion a year. But think of that in the context of the systems we're working within. The BC provincial government's annual expenditure is $45 billion. Our federal government expenditure is $280 billion. So our $3 billion disbursements is a small piece of a much larger systems. So we're not the dog. We're not, maybe not even the tail that wags the dog, because we disperse our money in small projects. And maybe they're just the fleas on the tail that wag the dog. But so let's be humble about what we do. But then also certainly recognize that we are in systems that are generating inequality. And there's that old expression, today's system is perfectly designed to deliver today's outcomes. And if you want different outcomes, what's the system you're in and what changes do you want? We've heard a lot about the residential school system, which was designed for particular outcomes. And we need to think about the systems that we're in today. And we're doing at Vancouver Foundation a lot of work in foster care, trying to get better outcomes for youth in care. So you need to look at the system. We're granting about $2 million a year into a provincial system that's $500 million a year in a department that's $1.4 billion. So recognize that you're in systems that generate inequality of outcomes, inequality of opportunity. Be humble about what you're doing. The second thing, I think this is maybe even more important than humility and understanding your size, is pay attention to your decision-making models. Are your decision-making models involving the voices of those that are being disadvantaged by a system? Are you working in a way that brings the voices of your grantees, the beneficiaries of your programs, governments, media, researchers into the process? Or are you sitting, taking a more top-down approach, thinking, I've analyzed the problem, I've analyzed the solution, I'm doing this because I think it's the right thing? I think if we're going to address systemic inequality, we must, in our decision-making processes, involve the voices of those that are living the outcomes. And we must pay attention to what they're saying. And finally, I would just summarize by saying that when you look at your organization, if you are engaging and empowering community voices and you're putting them first in your decision making, And if you are using a systems approach, that you're looking at the system you're working in, you're identifying the outcomes that you're unhappy with, you're granting towards better outcomes, and you're politically active, then you can say you're using wealth to address inequality. If you're not doing those things, you're likely a system maintainer as opposed to a system changer. And we all can adopt those behaviors. So I think we can do it, but only if we have certain attributes to the way that we work.
What a thoughtful answer. And I have a question, I think a linked question, which I'm going to pose to Kavita, which is that discussions on this topic, they generally do focus on ameliorating the effects of inequality rather than on the underlying causes or the kind of systemic reforms that might actually address it. So in your view, what is the best way for foundations to tackle inequality?
I mean, I think there's one of the big challenges, going back to the example I gave earlier, is that we understand inequality from the position of great privilege. And so the effort to be able to actually acknowledge that it's very difficult to step into another person's shoes, but that in fact those shoes are small and they pinch or they're torn and your feet are cold and that walking on that road is really painful, is more than humility. It is a level of saying, we actually don't know what that process is, and our system as it currently exists, even the structures of our philanthropic organizations, tend to default to what we are used to. And so who we surround ourselves with, who are other program officers, who are the decision makers on our boards, they do not tend to be the people from the communities that we are trying to serve. And so I think one big question for all of us, and the Ford Foundation is going through this right now, is what does walking the talk on equity mean within our own institutions? How must we look different? How must we speak different? How must we actually operate in a different way? And I'll give a very small example. When I went to the Delhi office of the Ford Foundation, in the prior administration, the person who had preceded Darren Walker at the Ford Foundation, there was an attempt to kind of get costs in line and to cut back on excessive costs for the foundation. Now, in almost every instance when you hear this, whether it's in the private sector or in philanthropy, where do those savings come from? Very rarely are vice presidents laid off. Very rarely are program officers laid off. So who gets laid off in these cost-cutting efforts? It is, in the case of the India office, it could be the people working on the grounds, the gardeners, the cleaners, the people who can least afford to lose a job in a very difficult situation. But that is where we make decisions, and we make them with all kinds of charts and good rationale for why this is the best way for it to happen. But until we're able to actually look at ourselves and say, no, we are actually just perpetuating a system of privilege within our own institutions, and until we change that around, we will be in a very poor position to actually try to be doing this to other people. So I think there's been a real emphasis on us being able to try and walk our talk. And I think that's really important. There's a recent report that I would encourage all of you to look at, that the Putnam Consulting Group, they were commissioned by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which has been looking at issues of health equity in the United States, which I don't need to tell a bunch of Canadians how terrible our health outcomes are and our access is as compared to your far superior system. But when you talk about issues of health equity, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation was looking at how many more foundations across the United States are actually trying to do something about issues of equity. So I think I would commend this report to you. It's called The Road to Achieving Equity. The second thing I would say, so first looking at yourselves, beginning to practice your own policies. I think the second issue for me is very much acknowledging that much of the pressure to change doesn't actually come from inside your institutions, but from outside. The private sector in the United States actually in many ways has been pushed further ahead because of court cases, because of class action suits. So you find that issues around diversity, equality, equity, and inclusion are often much further ahead in the for-profit sector, but not because they woke up one morning and said, oh dear, we would like to be so much better at this. No, because somebody slapped a lawsuit on them. And I think for us in the social justice world, to remember the same was true of social justice movements. We did not wake up one morning and say, oh, sorry, we meant to include blacks and women in our society or Native people in our communities. It was because those communities had protests, had a civil rights movement, had the women's rights movement, that laws were changed, constitutions were amended, and we made room for voices of people. In the context of India, the Dalit community, the untouchable community, these were not changes that happened because those who had power suddenly had the great wisdom to say, oh, we want to be more inclusive. So I think to acknowledge that and to say for ourselves, as philanthropy that has emerged out of some level of inequality, at the very least, to understand that we will often be shaken to make change, and that we should welcome that shaking and not close our doors to it and build a wall and build a fence to be able to kind of prevent that kind of change. So for me, I think those are the issues I would say are really
and that's a very nice segue to the really shaking work that Katrina Pacey does in our community. She's a well-known legal advocate and has had a huge impact, I think, both at a frontline and a systemic level. So, Katrina, I'm wondering if you can, you've done a lot of work to help people at the front line assert their rights and gain access to the tools they need to access the court system. Can you talk a little about how the law can be used as a tool to fight the root causes of poverty and social exclusion, and how you and your organization work with communities to engage them in shaping that vision for the future?
Thank you, Janet. I've already, changed my comments as I've listened to my fellow panelists. So what I'll do is I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we do, but hopefully it will resonate with you within your organizations in terms of some of the guiding principles behind Pivot's work and what I think you're hearing from our panelists. So we are a human rights organization that works on the ground in the downtown east side of Vancouver, and we use the law as a tool for social change. We believe it's very powerful to use the law because it shapes society, it reflects values and principles and guides society and how it's going to conduct itself. And so we use that tool, and I think we would all agree, as Kavita's mentioned, that it can be a very powerful way to shape and shift society. But what I wanted to talk about today is how law as the social determinant has become and is something that both can perpetuate equality but also inequality in who gets access to it. And so I'm going to make two main points. The first is some of the philosophy that underlies our work at Pivot. So we entered the downtown east side 15 years ago and entered that community as a group of lawyers and law students that really did not understand what that community needed in terms of change. It was a community that was in the midst of a human rights emergency, a public health disaster. Violence against women in that community was at absolute epidemic levels. It was a national and international tragedy what was taking place in our community. But one of the things I want to mention today is that Pivot and those of us like myself who came into that community not having that lived experience did not come with a set of assumptions about what the community needed and what needed to change. It was through a very deep listening and a very deep collaboration and partnership with people with those lived experiences that we were able to then decide what were the solutions, how could the law make their vision for social change a reality. So I think that's one point I'd like to reiterate, really, as Kevin did, that when you're thinking about the communities you're attempting to assist, it's very important to think about how they're engaged in the visioning. How are they involved? How are they empowered in the process? Which is often more than a meeting in a room like this with tables like this and a meal and a conversation. It's really thinking about meaningful leadership and that inclusion and involvement at the ground in terms of how does that perspective guide the philosophy of your organization and the actions that follow. And so if we take my second point, and if we take a sort of belief that the law shapes our society and that we should use it to both compel change and stop government actions that are wrong, then the next question is, how do we empower people to access that tool? And that's, of course, very fundamental to the work that we do, because we believe that the lack of access to the legal system and to law as a tool for social change, that in and of itself is a profound determinant of inequality. The fact that people do not have access to our courts, have access to parliament where laws are made, have access to all of these places of power is perpetuating inequality in the same way that our economic system is perpetuating inequality. And so I just wanted to give you a couple of examples, though, just to sort of deepen perhaps your understanding of what it would mean then to provide that access. So we, our organization did that deep listening, decided what were some of the changes that needed to be made in the policy areas in which we worked, and thought, okay, well, we need to give folks lawyers, and we need to walk through and charge through the doors of those courtrooms and demand that those changes be made and use the law to force that change. And it wasn't until we tried that we realized that those courtrooms were completely unsafe environments, that they were not places where people's voices and where movements could be fully empowered because of the systemic and structural barriers and issues that take place in these spaces that to me seem perfectly reasonable as a place where you might go in and demand to be heard. So for sex workers to make their way to the Supreme Court of Canada, they needed to find profoundly creative ways to get there. They needed to challenge all of the ways in which our court systems function in order to make their way to the Supreme Court of Canada after many, many levels of court and to ultimately have their day. For the homeless people we represented in Abbotsford, which is an hour east of here, they physically could not walk into a courtroom and tell their stories. So it required getting the court to move to a community-based location in Abbotsford and hold its hearings, frankly, in the basement of a Super 8 motel where we could put our clients up for the night, where they could sleep and have a shower and be fed and show up in court and in a position, in a place where they could courageously tell their stories. So I tell these stories to you just to perhaps inspire you to think about how you can create safe and empowered spaces to hear from those that you're so determined to serve. We all, and I include myself, do this work from a very dedicated place, but sometimes don't reflect enough on how we can really make sure that those spaces are safe and empowered for people to assist in the visioning at that kind of ground level of the work that we hope to do.
Isn't she marvelous? Well done. So I'm going to ask what may appear to be kind of a simple-minded question, but when we talk about inequality, we take for granted that it's a bad thing. But I would like to just ask the panelists to share with us why we should care. Why should we care about inequality? Somebody want to start with that?
Maybe I would say that there is a way in which, I remember in scripture class in the Christian school that I went to in India, there was this thing about there will be poor always. And from Jesus Christ Superstar, you might remember that line. There will be poor always, pathetically suffering. Look at the good things we've got. I think there's a way in which we have been seduced into believing that we can live with a certain level of inequality and that is just the way it is. And there's a way in which that creates a disarming sense of comfort. And I think the whole conversation that we're having now, some 30 years after Ronald Reagan, certainly in the United States, put in place a whole set of active policies that increased inequality significantly in the United States, but it is true all over the world, is that we are suddenly coming to a place where we realize that the actual outcomes for those of us who were relatively comfortable in the, oh, well, there's some level of inequality, but it's really okay, are now actually uncomfortable in very real ways. So I would say that I think one of the reasons we have to care, or we've been made to care about it, is that there is a bit of fear. There is a bit of, oh my goodness, my own well-being. So when people say enlightened self-interest, what they actually mean by that is, dang, my ship is going down too. Really, And it's unfortunate to say that, but I think really on some level that is part of the reason we must and do care, particularly those of us privileged to work in a sector like philanthropy, to be in a position where we are giving money away because we realize that it is actually something that will otherwise take the entire planet down with us.
I think, you know, most of the people in this room are convinced by the social justice arguments just from an ethical point of view. But there certainly is increasingly research that demonstrates the linkage between societies that have extreme inequality, have poorer health, and many more social problems than those that don't, and that the challenges really are across the whole population, so both the rich and the poor suffer in more unequal societies. That's certainly true. I'm going to ask a question actually about technology. I think we all are acutely aware of the exponential rate of technological innovation. There's an interesting study out of the Oxford Martin School a couple of years ago that predicts that the US economy could lose as much as 47% of traditional jobs within the space of 2 decades. Now, obviously, that will open up the potential for a lot of new creative work. But our social and our economic institutions aren't set up to deal with change that's that rapid. And so this could, in fact, lead to a further bifurcation of society. So I'm wondering if the panelists have any thoughts on what we could do about this, and whether foundations have any role in trying to, I guess, encourage the public discourse on this topic.
Sure, I'll jump in there. I was fortunate enough to go to a conference in Silicon Valley a couple of weeks ago, organized by Community Foundations of Canada. And it was right in the heartbed of technological disruption. And a large part of the conversation was about, yes, there's been change. People talk about how the candle makers no longer exist, the saddle makers no longer exist. But the reality is that we had a lot of time to adjust to those changes. They weren't as rapid as the ones that we're seeing now. So we are seeing incredibly rapid, the exponential change, the exponential adoption of work, and the fact that the disruptions are very quick. And the one that really struck me was that the single biggest employer of men in the United States, and probably the same in Canada, is driver, truck driver, taxi driver. It's the single biggest category. And with the increase of self-driving cars, there could be a very sudden and rapid displacement of people from the workforce. And the question really is, well, what systems do we have that can adapt to that? And how can we, in our support of the education system, retraining system, public policy systems, actually help our systems speed up? And I think it comes back to, again, some of the conversations we've been having the last few days, is that we can do pilot projects, we can try things quickly, iterate quickly, fail fast on social policy and adaptation, as well as people are doing on the technology side. So we have a role to play, but we must be conscious that these changes are actually faster than the changes we've seen in the past.
Interesting. Any other perspectives you want to share on that? It's kind of a difficult topic, isn't it?
I think the one thing about technology that I think for people who have been marginalized and on the outside, I think the space of democratizing that places like the internet have provided. I know when I worked as CEO and president of the Global Fund for Women, places where women could not have their voices heard in the traditional public spaces, they could have their voice heard on the internet. They could use mobile technology to be able to send a number or to text a friend if there was violence in the community. So I think that there are ways in which there is a potential for new technology to be more equalizing as a force, more democratizing as a force, to give marginalized communities a voice in spaces where they haven't had that. But equally, and Ford has a big program on protecting internet freedom, I think that space is rapidly closing as large companies and corporations try to seize the market opportunities of that space and to take it away from a space of being a more equalizing force for society. So I think we're going to all have to be more savvy about engaging with protecting that space. When we say we want to protect civil society space, it must include technological space if we want that space to be more equal as well for the future.
So I'm going to pose one more question to the panel, but I'd also like to open the floor for you. So if there's anyone who would like to pose a question to the panel, if you could perhaps stick your hand up, and then I know we have a roving mic. So while you're thinking of your questions, I'm going to ask the panelists to think about the fact that Canada ranks 12th out of 17 peer countries on inequality. the US is actually the worst, and the Nordic countries are the best. There's actually a bit of a joke that if Americans want to live the American dream, they should move to Denmark, right? I'm wondering, to the panelists, can we learn something from other jurisdictions? Are there things that we can import from countries that actually manage this issue much more effectively and apply them in our own context? And what role could foundations possibly play in that?
I mean, that's a huge question, and I think that, you know, we can look at Canada and where Canada ranks, and then we can look at British Columbia and where British Columbia ranks in terms of, you know, Canada-wide, in terms of poverty levels, in terms of the social welfare rates in BC. We at Pivot just participated in the great BC Welfare Challenge, which is to live on welfare rates for your food allowance for 1 week, which was $18 per person. So our entire organization attempted collectively to live on $18 worth of food for 1 week. And I just will share this just by way of kind of personal experience in both what it meant for me to kind of understand practically what that was like. And of course, it was a voluntary thing for 1 week, and I could opt out at any time. So it was vastly different than the reality of a person trying to live on BC social assistance rates. But in addition to that, it was just interesting for me to realize what it might be like, if that was my true lived experience, to move through the world and all of the spaces and places that I could not access because I either didn't have the money to access those places or otherwise wouldn't be entitled to. So I thought maybe I would just bring the question down to one very specific example, which is social assistance and the reality of the amount of time it takes to qualify for social assistance, what the rates mean for people, and what that means for how you live your life on social assistance and what your opportunities really are. So if I was to point to Nordic countries, I would start there.
All right, yeah, absolutely. And we both, I think, see this kind of situation in our day-to-day work on an ongoing basis, the people that we serve really at the front line. So Kevin, I think you have something to share on this.
He just wanted to add another example of where we can learn from. As I mentioned earlier, we're doing a lot of work in seeking better outcomes for youth in care. And BC has made progress. We used to be 11,000 kids in care in the province. We're down to 7,000. It's on the assumption that kids are better in families than in care, so we're definitely making progress. But we've also looked at our system as being one that is really focused on child protection and contrasting that to other systems around the world that are focused more on family supports so that the family is a safe place for kids. You'll see that the rates of youth in care in child protection-centered systems are up to 10 times higher than family-centered protection systems. And so we have other jurisdictions to look at, certainly across Canada, that have, we're sharing knowledge in terms of seeking better outcomes for kids, and we're looking around the world. So there are absolutely jurisdictions to learn from. We have made progress, but there's both progress in the same system, but then there's also the opportunity of actually shifting the frame and bringing other elements into place.
Thank you, Kevin. Do we have any questions from the floor? We have a question at the back of the room. If you could take a mic. We're short of time, so we'll just take a couple, but.
Thanks. I'll do it quick. I'm actually from Denmark.
Welcome.
But I do live in Toronto. I'm the president of the Global Compact Network Canada, and we had a session earlier today about the Sustainable Development Goals that also talk about inequality. Yes. But back to Denmark. So one of the things I was reflecting was that there's not that much talk about philanthropy. There's more talk about how do we actually embed good behavior into what companies do, what society does, etc. So I guess my question to you is, how can we take all the great work that you're doing, but actually influence that into society? And those of you who were in our session about the Sustainable Development Goals earlier today will know that that's one of the things that I'm trying to do, see how can we actually have a positive impact on society. Maybe it can be like Denmark, I don't know. So, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Panelists?
I actually wanted to say something about Denmark because I think it's interesting. I think Denmark brings up another contradiction for us, actually, with regard to this question of who is included and who is excluded. So yes, in some ways, Denmark is a remarkably equal and equitable place. And yet, those of us who've worked on migration globally know that the current crisis around migration across the European Union has raised all kinds of unpleasant aspects of societies that we usually like to think of as being unbelievably equitable. So it's easier, and I think this is important for us to think about as we talk about what it means to deal with a more unequal or less unequal society. It is easier to create more equal, inclusive societies when the people around you seem very familiar and like yourselves. It becomes much more complicated when they look different, when they dress different, when their accents are different, when the food smells like curry or turmeric or garlic, and you just don't have the same level of like, we're all in this together. That we're all in this together quotient is such a critical issue for us to actually acknowledge, so that part of the dilemma with SDGs is when you realize that the rest of the world has been dealing with refugees in much larger numbers than Europe or America can ever imagine. Pakistan, the country where my husband's family comes from, has dealt with over 5 million Afghan refugees for the last 25 years. It has not received EU help, it has not received anybody else's help, and so on I can go. Kenya deals with Somali refugees and Sudanese refugees. So the poorest countries of this world actually face the biggest burdens in being able to integrate, quote unquote, the other or the vulnerable or the weak. So when we think about what we can learn from others, perhaps it is not just those who are very privileged that we should be looking from, but also the people who actually have much less. You will find poor people are much more generous than the wealthiest people in the world in terms of how much money they give of their own assets. So just to bear in mind.
Yeah. Absolutely. Kevin, did you have something to share?
Just two quick things building on that last point. One of the reasons, if you look across Canada, the most generous communities are the poorest communities because they're not separated from poverty. They see also the benefits of philanthropy. If you're able to go from your house to work and not see either poverty or opportunity or the benefits of philanthropy, you don't think it matters. So you're just not part of it. So I think the more things that we can do to expose people to build the sense that we are in it together, that we're building a society collectively, the better off we are. But the other thing that I see is when I think of systems, and the biggest transformational force out there right now are the spending preferences of millennials who want to buy products from companies that they view are green, socially responsible. And that's having a much bigger change than I think even us as investors. When you think of good corporate behavior, it's the consumer that's driving the change at that business, not the investor, in my view. So I think we need to really be understanding and supportive of the changes that we're seeing in consumer behavior to change the behavior of our system.
Well said. You know, I've always believed in the importance of reaching out and making a conscious effort to engage with people whose views are different from ours. You know, when you're only talking to people who share your views and share your experience, essentially you're only talking to yourself, right? So it is fundamentally important to do that, because that's the only way that we'll be able to identify and build common ground.